It's been a little while now that I wanted to talk to you about a philosopher whom I discovered a few years ago after my studies in philosophy, and who has not left me indifferent. And I can even say that this year is my favorite philosopher. This philosopher is Schopenhauer, a German philosopher of the 18th and 19th century, a man who had a rather original and personal worldview, quite powerful, and I would have liked to briefly expose it to you in a few words. So, Schopenhauer was a unique thinker, a bit peculiar, both in his worldview and in his behavior. His way of doing things, his way of expressing himself. For example, he was someone who did not hesitate to attack directly, including with insults those with whom he disagreed. In Schopenhauer's time, the most prominent, reputed, and appreciated philosopher was Hegel, and Schopenhauer did not hesitate to mock Hegel, whom he called an academic philosopher. For him, the university at that time was merely an extension of the ideology of the state. He was completely against the institution, against university teaching, against official philosophy. And it is understandable that he also developed a certain form of frustration from not being recognized in his time as a great mind, a full-fledged philosopher. So, I was telling you that Schopenhauer had an original worldview. What was his worldview? This worldview he developed and presented in his best-known work, a quite monumental work, The Word as Will and the Representation. Well, for Schopenhauer, the world as we know it, as we see it, as we study it, is not in a certain way the real world. It's rather the shell of the world, a facet of the world, what we might call the external face of the world, and that's what he calls representation. This word, the representation, is the word that we perceive, that we analyze, and try to make sense of, especially through science, through intellect, through reason. In this world that is ours, things make sense, things obey the law of causality, the principle of sufficient reason, meaning that a cause produces an effect, and no effect exists without a cause. Nothing happens without reason, and we can make sense of everything that happens. That's the scientific vision of the world, which we could call the materialistic vision of the world. Schopenhauer himself totally escapes these categories of materialism or idealism. He is situated beyond. This word, the representation, is also the word of space and time, meaning we are in a world where everything necessarily inscribes in space and time. We cannot represent something outside of space. Space is essentially the structure of our mind and of our being. We cannot represent things without space. Outside of space, we cannot represent them, nor outside of time either. Everything is subject to a chronology. There is always a before and an after, and a during. But we cannot think outside of this idea of temporality. We cannot think, let's say, of eternity. Moreover, when we think of time, we always imagine it in a divided form. The past, the present, and the future. And if we think about it, the past and the future do not exist, since they are mental representations. The only thing that exists is the present, and for Schopenhauer, the only thing that really exists beyond the world of representation is the moment, and the moment is eternity. So, if I want you to understand exactly what Schopenhauer means by representation, I will have to go through what he calls the will. So what is the will? Well, it's somewhat the inner face of the world, what the philosopher Kant called the thing in itself, and which is, you could say, the unfathomable foundation of reality. The unfathomable foundation, meaning it's something in reality that cannot be conceived by the mind, that cannot be grasped by the intellect. It's something that completely escapes our comprehension capabilities. I said earlier that we think and represent things always through two categories, which are space and time. We cannot think outside of these categories. Well, the will is precisely what is outside of space and time. So it is what escapes our representation categories, our thought categories. So it's something that is totally ungraspable to us by the tools of the intellect. While presentation of the will is the source of our physical world, of the other observable material world, which I could have called the world of representation. For Schopenhauer, the world of representation is the expression of the world of the will. The word expression is interesting because if we decompose expression, it means what is pushed outwards in a way. So the word of representation is what is pushed by the word of the will. It is the visible surface of the will and is the only reality to which, in fact, we have access. I will try to say it another way. For Schopenhauer, the will is the intimate letters of the word, while the word of representation is the surface of the word. It's the external film of the word. To take an image, it's a bit like if I talk about the ocean. Well, the representation of the ocean is its surface. It's what we see. It's what is on the outside. It's what is expressed. While the will of the ocean, well, those are rather the underwater depths and the surface of the water. It's the expression of the underwater depths, which are inaccessible. They are in reality, since we can dive underwater. But for Schopenhauer, we cannot dive into the well. We are forced to remain on the surface of the representation. So, if we continue the thread of Schopenhauer's thought, in reality, we do not truly know the world. We know its surface, we know its outer film, we know the representation, so maybe I will say a few words about it. And this is what makes, for example, when I see a water bottle in front of me. For me, it's a water bottle, period. It's nothing more than what I see of it. I can touch it and I can measure it and I can describe it. And for me, it's the only reality as a thinking subject. As a being who has a consciousness, I perceive the world around me and I do not tell myself, this world is the representation. For me, it's the world. It's the only world that exists. This is what limits the power of man, because precisely man is not capable of going beyond the world of representation, at least not capable by the tools of the intellect. So when, for example, scientists produce knowledge, they produce knowledge about reality, about physical reality or material reality. They produce knowledge about the world of representation. Obviously, this length of representation may very well suffice for us. We can be content with this world, telling ourselves, after all, it's the world in which I evolve. I have no reason to want to search for a kind of back world or another world or two primal worlds, since the world of representation suits me very well. It's true, but for Schopenhauer, this world of representation is also a world of illusions. It's a world of illusions because it's a world that makes us believe that we are superior to what we really are. So let's explain if humans don't have possession of sciences, but are in possession of intellect. Intellect is what makes a man a superior animal. It's an animal that has the capacity to intellectually represent the world. He is capable of transforming images into conceptual images. So for Schopenhauer, a man is a conceptual animal. That is to say, an animal that has the intellectual consciousness of the world, of representation, of the world in which he lives. But this world is an illusion, because whatever we do, as elevated as our intellectual capacities are, we can understand how the world works. It's the job of scientists, using the principle of causality. Each cause produces an effect. We can understand this world in its operation, in its mechanisms, but we are incapable of understanding why. We are incapable of understanding its meaning. Why? Well, because to understand the meaning of the word in its intimacy, it would be necessary to be able to penetrate the world of the will, and we do not have access to it. So everything we are going to say from now on will only be a way of confirming that. In fact, we can say nothing about this world of the will. We will still try. So an important idea for Schopenhauer is that this world of the will, we have an indirect knowledge of it, since the world of representation is in some way the means by which the world of the will manifests itself, reveals itself, becomes accessible to our consciousness. We ourselves, as individuals, as human subjects, are manifestations of the will. We are its products, its productions. So, if humans were capable of knowing themselves, they would be able to know an aspect of the will, the aspect under which the will manifests itself through them. So there is still something that we can know about the humankind. It's the fact that they live, so life is at the heart of the world of representation, since we have knowledge of it. And again, as with the will, we know roughly how life works, but we do not know why there is life. And that is the fundamental problem of the will. It lets itself be known in its modes of operation through the world of representation, but does not let itself be known through its reason for being. For Schopenhauer, the will has no reason for being, just as life has no reason for being, and that's all we can say about it. It is through us, it is around us, it is before us and after us, but we can know nothing of it. Why? We can know nothing of its purpose, because its purpose is simply to perpetuate itself in time. The will is beyond time, we said earlier, in the world of representation. It is therefore timeless. It perpetuates itself indefinitely, and we individuals are only the means by which life and the will perpetuate themselves. How to make this idea a bit understandable? Well, by saying that everyone admits that we have what is called the survival instinct. The survival instinct is what makes it so that in certain situations, when our life is threatened, we deploy a kind of unconscious strategy to stay alive, to maintain our existence. And this survival instinct, as an instance, is of animal origin. It is not rational, it is not logical. We don't even know why we have this survival instinct, and we don't even know why we obey it. And yet we obey it. The survival instinct is thus a form of will that manifests itself in an individualized manner for us humans. In the same way that we don't know why we want to survive, but we try to survive. Well, the will, we don't know why it is there, but it is there. And it perpetuates through where it has no reason to be. It has no logic, it has no sense. Its sense is only to perpetuate itself and its existence. For Schopenhauer, it is tragic. That is to say, we are aware that there is life, but we don't understand why there is life. There is will, but we don't understand why there is will. For Schopenhauer, the humankind is the victim of fundamental illusion that he could be free. He believes that he decides his own actions and that he is the master of his life, that he is the master of his actions, that he is the one who has control. Individuals believe they are free, when in fact they are only the localized expression of the will. In fact, all of us humans, we don't realize that we are working for the will. That is, we are working for the perpetuation of a life that we don't understand, which has no sense, which has no why, and yet we all exert our efforts to perpetuate this life, a life which Schopenhauer says is primarily a source of suffering. Schopenhauer says there is much more suffering than happiness in life, and despite this suffering, we persist in wanting to perpetuate a city, knowing that it will make Sassan happy, knowing that we cannot understand its meaning, and knowing that it is completely eluding. So, for those who know the reference, the movie The Usual Suspects is about a gang of criminals who end up having the account for a massacre that took place on a boat, and at one point the name of the ultimate criminal, named Kaiser Soze, appears. Kaiser Soze is the figure of the boogeyman, who inspires terror and dread, and whom one would especially not like to meet. Kaiser Soze's particularity is that he makes people work for him, without knowing they are working for him. So much so that he can cross paths with them, he can talk to them, he can have a lighthouse to them, and no one will know that he's Kaiser Soze. No one will know that he's working for him at that moment. Well, we can say that the will is Kaiser Soze. It makes individuals work in the world of representation without telling them, without them knowing, without even them being able to understand it. And yet they do it. They do it the same. They do it voluntarily when we reproduce life, when we work to perpetuate the word of the will, while the will has not asked us anything, but simply we are the expression of the will. Life has no other purpose than to perpetuate itself. So life is a purpose without a purpose. The purpose is to perpetuate and perpetuate. And why? We don't know. It doesn't make sense, and yet we perpetuate. We want to live, but without knowing why. We have a blind law of existence that pushes us to want to maintain ourselves in life without knowing why we want to maintain ourselves in life. This is where we come to a very interesting aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy, which is the question of love. What is love? Well, it won't surprise us for Schopenhauer. Love is still an illusion. It's an illusion that the will gives to individuals so that they agree to perpetuate the species, so that they agree to perpetuate the indefinite side of life. When we are in love, we want to unite with the person we love, and from this love, a child is born. That is to say, from this love, life is born. Love is therefore the means, the instrument used by the species and beyond the species, the will, so that life can perpetuate, so that the will itself can perpetuate. But you might say yes, but love is not what makes us reproduce, it's sexual desire that makes us reproduce, yes, and well, for Schopenhauer, love and sexual desire are exactly the same thing. In fact, love is simply the culturally acceptable form of sexual desire. Earlier, I mentioned that mankind is a conceptual animal, but for Schopenhauer, mankind and animals are exactly the same. Both are driven by the logic of persevering in life, of maintaining their existence. Both possess the survival instinct. Both reproduce, and in the end, the only difference between man and animals is that mankind questions the meaning of his existence, while the animal is content just being in existence. This leads us to the conclusion that there is no moral or mental suffering in animals. There is no depression in animals as there is in humans. Since the human being questions the meaning, and in the absence of an answer, this necessarily affects his relationship to existence, thereby affecting his moral, mental, and emotional life. So love, as I was saying, is the culturally acceptable form of sexual desire. For example, when a man seduces a woman, well, he simply takes an indirect path to reach what is the goal, that is sexual desire, which itself must lead to reproduction. So ladies, when you are being courted, well, the man who courts you is seeking to perpetuate the species through you, and if you accept his advances, you agree to perpetuate the species through him. We can say that the process of seduction, which is at work in the expression of human sexual desire, is nothing more than a labyrinth, a maze that inevitably leads to one outcome, which is reproduction. That's why for many, seduction is something of an act of hypocrisy. For Schopenhauer, it's hypocrisy, because, in fact, we know in advance where it will lead. It will lead to bed, it will lead to the sexual act, and the sexual act having reproduction as its purpose. Well, seduction leads to reproduction. In love, there is something that adds to sexual desires, that is the feeling. And for Schopenhauer, this feeling, despite its somewhat mysterious side, is nothing more than what allows us to accept the fact that we are designed and determined to reproduce ourselves. Since we are conceptual animals, we are metaphysical animals, animals that create meaning. And the idea that we could behave exactly like animals, that is to copulate brutally and then to leave offspring after us, is something that is not bearable to our consciousness, something that we are not ready to accept because of our vanity. As Schopenhauer calls it, our pride, our ego, makes us want so much to convince ourselves that we have control over our lives, over what we do, our choices, and even the feeling that we cannot accept this idea. So love is in a way nature's subterfuge, the subterfuge of the will to make us consent to the endless repetition of the cycle of life. But again, love is what gives meaning to a conjugal relationship. But behind all this, why is there? Well, there is sexuality. And for Schopenhauer, sexuality is the primitive foundation of life, thus the expression of the will in its most raw but also its purest form, since through sexuality the will manifests itself, almost as is. Sexuality is something completely irrational. That is, if we ask ourselves, why I have sexual desire for this person? There is no rational explanation. We can only observe the desire. We cannot explain it. We cannot explain its why. We can explain its how. We come back to what we said earlier about the difference between the why and the how. The will is the why. We cannot know it. Representation is the how. It's the only thing we can know. So we can explain it, possibly the mechanism of sexual desire and the mechanism of sexual functioning, but we can never explain the why of desire. And here Schopenhauer makes a small remark. He says that it's when the sexual act is finished that we become aware of its absurd character. After the sexual act, Schopenhauer says the feeling of shame that invades us is a feeling of lucidity, an acknowledgement of lucidity about the fundamental bestiality that constitutes us. And this fundamental bestiality is the will, since it's this brute force that expresses itself through us in a completely irrational and unleashed manner. So it's the will that expresses itself in sexual desire, and ultimately sexual desire might be the best representation we can have of the will in the world of representation. So it is the will that expresses itself in sexual desire, and ultimately sexual desire might be the best representation we can have of the will in the world of representation. We have seen that the world of the will, this kind of chaotic, formless world that structures the world of representation, is recognizable. It is impenetrable, but it lets itself be guessed in a certain way through certain phenomena. And sexual desire is really the human phenomenon in which the world of the will expressed itself in the most direct and accessible manner. Now, I will read to you a short passage from Schopenhauer on the sexual instinct. The sexual instinct is the cause of war and peace. It is the foundation of serious action, the object of jokes, an inexhaustible source of wit, the key to all illusions, explanations of every sign, but also of all unspoken propositions, of every furtive glance. End quote.